Okay, welcome to part three, in which we're going to very quickly try to cover some of the major social theories of space and place. Let's move through this. One of the foremost thinkers about place and space is somebody who is whose name is pronounced Walter Benjamin, and he composed a stupendous work of interdisciplinary scholarship between the late 1920s and the 1940s. He was theorizing space and place and basically urban design before there was a field called that. And he was really drawn to the work of an earlier French philosopher and essayist called Charles Baudelaire, who was writing in the 1850s, a period when Paris went through massive urban renewal and transformation. The 1850s is known as the age of Second Empire in France, and it was, let's say, a good generation of social stability after the great unrest of the French Revolution. But one of the questions that preoccupied Walter Benjamin throughout this project, and in the many ways that he addressed it via fashion and architecture and subjectivity and personhood and all kinds of things, was how the built environment shapes new forms of subjectivity in relations to space and place, which is important because it led to a whole other field of thinkers, including later human geographers, that began to apply similar questions to all kinds of issues of space and place. So the issue that was trying to be addressed during the period of Second Empire in the 1850s in France was that the city had grown massively. It was a period that was not only growing as an important trade center, but also of commerce. We're seeing the early Industrial Revolution, and Paris was seen as a place of culture and trade and shopping, whereas other cities were perhaps more often seen as places of manufacture. There was a massive growth during this period between the revolution in 1789 and 1820. You can look at the population statistics yourself. And one of the things they were trying to do was deal with crowd control, deal with the problems that happen when you get a lot of people in one place. We'd seen how that had led to the growth of mobs during the French Revolution, and this was something that they were trying to address. There was also a growth of petty crime, pickpockets, the kind of people that you read about in Dickens' work of the same period and written in English, right? And these were difficult to police. So the arcades were a series of glass-covered shopping avenues, and we still have some like that in Melbourne, and I think even perhaps one or two of them in Brisbane, in Sydney as well, when you think that some of our early city design was modeled on some of the urban planning of this era. Now, they were mostly destroyed by the time of the 1920s to the 1940s, and the figure of the flaneur who Benjamin said came out of this new social design was largely a thing of the past by then, but he was fascinated by its appearance and how social space and the design of social space had created this new form of being. Now, this meant that although the arcades were perhaps designed as a tool of crowd management to give people pathways through shopping streets, they were also accorded their own, garbage picker-uppers and shit cleaner-uppers, and so they were kept clean and sanitary as well. The point that that Benjamin is making is that they urge not just different engagements with space, but also different kinds of people, different ways of being in the world. And this is written about in your blog reading this week, One Way Street, a Turtle on a Leash. And so we saw the growth of the flaneur during this period, who is a kind of a street rambler. He was somebody who would walk through this area and take his time, and he was a watcher, he was a dandy. By dandy would be somebody who dressed in a way to draw attention to himself. Some flaneurs were like that, and others appeared to be withdrawn from the crowd. Not necessarily an image of spectacle, certainly not engaging in shopping themselves, but a meanderer through these new social spaces, surveying them, watching them, taking them in, becoming almost a piece of art within the shopping space in the fashion that they sometimes took on. And the reason why they are often associated with a turtle on a leash was it was an exotic thing at the time of the growth of the European empires to acquire tropical animals like tortoises. And, these days you'd see poodles in the avenues of Paris in those days, the fashionable creature was the tortoise. And of course, they ambled very slowly. And so ambling slowly became a characteristic of the flaneur. Now, we need to begin to give ourselves some words to talk about space and place in different and more nuanced ways than we've been doing so far. And we're going to skip forward quite a bit in time, past Baudelaire in the 1850s and then past Benjamin in the 1920s and 40s, all the way to probably one of the foremost and earliest human geographers, Ifutuan, whose readings are listed in your additional readings if you'd like to write on this concept for your case study essay. He was one of the first geographers who differentiated between the word space and the word place. And he defined it this way. He said what begins as undifferentiated space, so disorganized, kind of sometimes empty, all nebulous, becomes place as we get to know it and as we endow it with value. And so the urban design of the arcades would be one way in which that happened, in which a random, disorganized, mob-like place became organized by structures and avenues and sorts of shops and sorts of people who then began to occupy that space. So place is a space endowed with meaning and value. And whereas physical geographers study landforms and forces that bring them into being, the evolution of the human field of geography, human geography in the 1990s, was a form of cultural geography in which people were interested in studying placemaking, studying humanly constructed places and the forces that brought them into being and how people endow space with meaning to make place. So Tuan's key point is that space and place are not interchangeable words, but actually different phenomena. Now, as this quote says here, geographers have long spoken of the importance of place as a unique focus, distinguishing geography from other disciplines. Astronomy has the heavens, although we've talked already today about how perhaps it took up more of a preeminence in a period when we needed to look at the stars instead of to Siri to find our way or to our GPS. He said, history has time and geography has place. A major question geographers ask sooner or later is, however, what is place? And this happens in every single field when we start to complexify things. What is power actually? We asked last week, what is place? Is something human geographers started to ask when they realized it wasn't just a synonym for location, something that they could look up in the Oxford English Dictionary, or a unique assemblage of nature and culture, but they wondered if they could theorize it in more careful ways that we're going to be asking you to do as well. So beginning in the 1970s and through to its flowering in the 1990s and beyond, some of the critical, important human geographers who started asking these questions were Ifutuan and Bedimer and Edward Ralph. They grew frustrated, and this is often how new fields of study emerge, with the limitations they felt in the field of geography that already existed. They thought there was a facile understanding of place in their discipline of geography. That's very preeminent idea was place. So it founded human geography, which looks at how people think about place. So Tuan says space becomes place by the relationships that we make. We've already thought about how people make maps, surveys, measurements. He also said data and spatial laws. Of course, architectural design is, as we've just looked at in the Arcades project, is one way space becomes place. They also started to study animals at this point, the way that animals thought about territory or domicile, how bodies perhaps were vertically oriented like seahorses and humans, but then other bodies of other creatures experience space in a very different way. Think about snakes, for instance, or whales. And we started to ask questions about what domicile means. Is it the same as home? And what territory means, for example. We started to, at this point, see a flowering of geographers that started to think a lot more about a field called semiotics that we'll learn more about in our unit on our week on narrative, when they thought about how people make place through symbols and through writing, through stories and traditions and narratives. And another way that we consider place is by experiential phenomenon, a field called phenomenology, experiencing and observing what people say and feel, things that are often hard to put words to, like intimacy, or homeliness, or freedom, or openness. So theories of space and place draw from philosophical fields that were already established in a field called phenomenology, which it really is just a fancy word to say the interpretive study of human experience. The aim, as Seaman in 2000 writes, of phenomenology of place is to examine and clarify human situations, events, meanings, experiences as they are known in everyday life, but typically unnoticed, beyond the level of conscious awareness, beyond the threshold of everyday noticing. You'll notice this is a common theme. So this is where we go beyond that. This is some of the things that you can generally notice too. In theories, we're going to go beyond that and start to think in a little bit more of a deep way. And that's what human geographers studying the phenomenology of place began to do. Now, in my field of literary studies, one of the theorists of place and space, when I was studying my undergrad in 1990s, who was very popular to think about, was Henry Lefebvre. And again, like Foucault, he was writing in the 60s and 70s. And again, like Foucault, it was delayed in the way in which that was translated into the academy in English and probably didn't appear in English until about the 1990s. And his major point was that place is a social complex or product. It's a complex social construction based on values and the social exchange and production of meanings, which affects spatial practices and perceptions. So again, he's drawing on and agreeing with Ifutuan in the other field of geography, saying, this isn't just space. Place is something socially constructed. And it's often imagined, as we talked about before. It's related to our interior mental life. Our experience of space is, of course, however, related to physical space. And we put that on a spectrum from alienation to ideas of belonging to ideas of needing to campaign for spatial justice, for example, in terms of campaigns for social housing that were very prominent during the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. Another preeminent French philosopher and thinker around the same time as Lefebvre, whom has informed many different fields across the arts, social sciences, and creative arts, is somebody called Michel de Certeau. Again, died around the same time as Foucault, but again, really didn't make it into the English-speaking academy until the 1990s. And to this day, people still draw on his ideas and build on him and stand on one of those shoulders of giants, right? So he is also thinking about the phenomenology of space and place, just like Lefebvre was. But he really, in this book, it's a really funky book, and he thinks about place from all kinds of ways that people walk through cities. And of course, you can see that that's inspired by Benjamin's work, but he's looking at it in the modern day, in the 1970s and 80s. And what he's seeing is, and one of his major things that kind of ties us back to our last week's social theory on power, at Foucault in particular, is that you can see that some urban design encodes strategies. It tries to police the way in which traffic flows through certain roads, goes one way or not. You can think about if you've been to Brisbane or some of the major cities in Australia, where they have malls that are closed to traffic, and that's a form of crowd control as well. There's certain buildings you need swipe cards to enter, other buildings you need to have security clearances to go into. And of course, in the time of COVID, we're all having to check in with our apps. And, of course, we're learning as well that, these plans to contain people at home when we're in quarantine or in hotel quarantine. What Certeau says is these are plans designed from above, usually from people in positions of instrumental power, whether it's bureaucratic power or otherwise, but usually in some office, right? Sometimes institutional power in the case of COVID, that would also be related to the medical, epidemiology field, right? But despite these best efforts to strategize ways to plan space, to control people, and to control their experience of places, what Certeau was noticing in this period that Foucault was also writing in, which was a period of major social upheaval, was that people often developed forms of resistance against those intended designs. And he called those tactics, and that was sort of power from below. So despite the fact that city streets were meant to be swept clean, for example, and free of crime, an idea that's still a hangover from the design of the arcades, for example, and there's all kinds of laws about what you could or could not do. We see the flourishing of urban graffiti. And he would say that would be a form of resistance from below, where people are adding their ideas of design and fashion and not leaving it up to people in authority to do that. Other forms of tactics are, jaywalking, for example, or ways people can find to navigate through a city that are counter to what perhaps an urban planner may have intended. And if you want to read more about it, you can go on and look at that URL. Which I'm going to look at the next slide, but you can just look up strategies and tactics, and a basic Wikipedia entry will explain it in more detail. Now, the thing about strategies versus tactics that this lovely little post that I found for you talks about is that it does relate back to power, stating that a tactic is determined by the absence of power. So it's somebody who is, not socially imbued or authoritatively imbued by the government with power. Perhaps they're cool punks or something like that, but they're not people who are officials, right? And he says a strategy is organized by the postulation of power, somebody who is accorded official authority. But when thinking of different examples of strategies and tactics, he says, what I just thought of comes to mind when I think of power. When staring at my computer, it hit me that one of the most powerful corporations' logos was looking right at me. Google, of course. Google employs many strategies, as we all know. I've seen some of you write about them in your wonderful blogs about algorithms, for example. But what he points out is that despite these strategies, there are individual hackers who use tactics in return. For example, Google uses strategies to develop its highly used search engine, such as the PageRank algorithm. And it was exposed recently that people can pay more money, and they do pay more money to have their information come up first, which is one of the reasons why scholars say, please do not use Google. Please go to authoritative, peer-reviewed academic work. The corporation also uses strategies to target users with their advertising through algorithms, of course. And as Google is one of the most powerful corporations in the world, he says they are not exempt of falling victim to various oppositional tactics in the way that Jussot talked about. Using space. An example of such a tactic could be Google bombing. A Google bomb is when Google search results are tampered with. The idea is to cause a web page to rank highly in the search engine results under an unrelated or irrelevant word or topic by heavily linking them. And so one of the ways that you might see that is that the hacker group, Anonymous, will quite often try to do this. But you can see people tinkering with web pages on Wikipedia as well. Wikipedia has editors, and things have to pass now through series of controls. So they have also put strategies to try to avoid these hacker tactics. But despite that, you will sometimes find purposely incorrect information. And that's another reason why academics sometimes don't favor Wikipedia, though it is because of these strategies becoming perhaps a more authoritative version of information, at least everyday information, than it used to be. Now, there's a whole other question we could get into about what's available on Wikipedia, just like what was available in the old-time encyclopedias and what's not, right? And it's often interesting to see what pages aren't there versus what are there. But talking about Google bombing, he says a Google bomb, which is a tactic that is used by a hacker, is when Google search results are tampered with to cause a page to link very heavily with something else. So in the description below of what you'd find on that link, this is a bit old now and what Google used to look like, it would be like, these are the things that you're going to find when you click onto this hyperlink. And the idea was to cause interesting algorithms to appear under this. So for a while, for instance, in 2006, a search for the words miserable failure or failure brought the #1 result of the biography of President George W. Bush. So this is an example of how on the internet people can use tactics to undercut the designed algorithmic strategies. And of course, we can begin to think about the dissemination of information in unauthorized ways on the internet in a further week as well. Now, Edward Ralph is another very important human geographer we need to be thinking about, and he is one of the first people that introduced this idea of place and placelessness. So this is different from place and space, even though earlier human geographers said that place is space endowed with meaning, and space is disorganized. Ralph kind of added this other category. Placelessness is not the same as space, he said. And what he wanted to do was say that experiences of space exist on a continuum from direct experience on one end to abstract thoughts or models on the other. So modes of spatial experience that are just cerebral or ideal or intangible are what he would say more placeless. And then modes of spatial experience that are instinctive, bodily, intimate, where you can have body memories of like, I remember being here as a child, or I remember the smell of cedar boxwood, or I remember the smell of the perfume that my mother used to wear, or, walking through this mall evokes this feeling I had in when I was a kid in 1986, this is all aging me with these examples I'm giving you, but this is the way he's giving us spacelessness, which is just cerebral and intangible, to space that is instinctive or bodily or immediate. And they're not mutually exclusive all the time, but they're part of the lived experience of space and place, and that added an extra dimension for us to think about. He also added ideas about insideness or outsideness. If a person feels inside or safe or enclosed or protected, they're more inside a place, the stronger his identity is linked to that place. And this brings us back to strong ties, right? If a person is outside a place, they feel alienated or separate from a place, they can feel homesick in a new place. These also can change over time. Of course, what once felt at home can feel uncannily strange or unfamiliar later on after you leave. And that's the experience of migrants. Quite often, I've had that experience. I've lived in Australia for 18 years now and gone back to where I grew up, where I only have 2 living relatives now, and it feels incredibly alienating to go back there, as much as I also have this uncanny sense of this is home. So sometimes these two things, insideness and outsideness, can exist at the same time, just as sometimes place and placelessness, he said, don't always have to be dichotomous. There's elements that can exist at the same time. So he also said placelessness is the casual eradication of distinctive places and the making of standardized landscapes that results in insensitivity to the significance and particularity of a place. It can be caused by instrumentalist approaches to places that function as just sheer institutions like a jail or like Stocklands in any city, rather than something that feels like a unique shopkeeper's shop, for example. And he said he saw it increasingly arising in the 1980s from places of standardized or commoditized symbols over places. And of course, a sense of placelessness can also be involved in erasing or disrespecting existing attachments